I laughed when the CEO mocked the janitor. Then he flew a helicopter and left everyone silent. The polished mahogany desk gleamed under the harsh, fluorescent lights of the executive suite, a stark contrast to the worn linoleum floors I'd walked on just hours before. My suit felt stiff, alien, a costume for a play I hadn't auditioned for. I was a junior analyst, barely a year out of college, and the air in this room, thick with the scent of expensive cologne and stale ambition, was intoxicating. Across from me, bathed in the sterile glow, sat Mr. Thorne, the CEO, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and terror in the breakrooms. He was recounting a story, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention, about his early days, a tale of rags to riches that was as cliché as it was compelling. He'd built this empire from nothing, a testament to his drive, his vision, his ruthlessness. I felt a tremor of something akin to admiration, a dangerous seed planted in the fertile ground of my own burgeoning ambition. My own life, a series of small, unremarked struggles, felt insignificant in the face of his colossal success. The pressure to perform, to impress, to simply belong in this rarefied atmosphere was a physical weight. Every breath felt calculated, every glance measured. I was acutely aware of my relative insignificance, a small cog in a vast, intricate machine, and the desire to prove myself, to ascend, to shed the skin of my past, was a gnawing hunger. This was the precipice, the moment where the ordinary world I knew began to fray at the edges, replaced by the glittering, terrifying allure of power. I'd spent years believing that success was a zero-sum game, that to rise, others had to fall. It was a belief forged in scarcity, in the quiet desperation of watching my parents work themselves to the bone for meager returns. This mindset, this ingrained cynicism, was my armor, my shield against the perceived unfairness of the world. It was a lens through which I viewed every interaction, every opportunity, every person. The CEO's story continued, a meandering chronicle of his ascent. He spoke of sacrifices, of sleepless nights, of betrayals overcome. He painted himself as a lone wolf, a visionary who had to make tough decisions, decisions that, in his telling, were always for the greater good of the company. I listened, absorbing every word, my own internal monologue a frantic echo of his triumph. I saw myself in his narrative, or rather, I saw the version of myself I desperately wanted to become. My own moral compass, still somewhat unformed, was easily swayed by the magnetic force of his success. I was eager to learn his secrets, to emulate his strategies, to adopt the very worldview that had elevated him to such dizzying heights. The unspoken question hung in the air. What would it take for me to reach that level? My own experiences had taught me that kindness was a weakness, that empathy was a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd seen people get stepped on, overlooked and dismissed, and I'd learned to do the same, a survival mechanism honed by years of feeling invisible. This was the foundation upon which I'd built my professional persona, sharp, analytical, and utterly detached. The idea that there might be another way, a way that didn't involve crushing others, was a foreign concept, a whisper I couldn't quite hear above the roar of my own ambition. I was so focused on the destination, on the glittering prize of success, that I hadn't considered the path, or more importantly, the people I would leave in my wake. Then he paused. His gaze, which had been fixed on some distant point of triumphant memory, shifted, landing on something just beyond my shoulder. His smile, which had been broad and self-congratulatory, tightened, a subtle hardening that sent a ripple of unease through me. He gestured with his chin, a barely perceptible movement, towards the far corner of the expansive office. My eyes followed, and I saw him. He was older, his frame stooped, his uniform a faded blue that seemed to absorb the light. He was meticulously cleaning the glass doors that led to the executive hallway, his movements slow, deliberate, almost apologetic. He had a smudge of something dark on his cheek, a ghost of the grime he spent his days erasing. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge our presence, a man accustomed to being overlooked, to being as transparent as the glass he polished. Mr. Thorne's voice, which had been so full of booming self-importance, dropped to a near whisper, laced with a cruel amusement. "Look at him," he drawled, his tone dripping with disdain. "He's been here 20 years, same job, same pathetic life. Probably thinks this is all he deserves." The words, sharp and cold, sliced through the air. A laugh, short and unpleasant, escaped his lips. And then, to my own horror, I joined him. It was a nervous, involuntary sound, a reflex born of that same ingrained cynicism, that desperate need to align myself with power, to signal my understanding of his brutal hierarchy. My laugh was a betrayal, a confirmation of everything I'd come to believe about the world. It was a moment of profound moral failure, a cheap, hollow sound that echoed the emptiness I would soon discover within myself. The janitor, his back still to us, flinched, a barely visible tremor that spoke volumes. In that instant, the polished mahogany, the expensive cologne, the intoxicating scent of ambition, it all turned sour, leaving a bitter metallic taste in my mouth. The world, which had seemed so clear and ordered just moments before, suddenly felt warped, distorted, and I, along with the CEO, had irrevocably broken something precious. The sound of my own laughter, a brittle, unwelcome noise, hung in the air, a stark counterpoint to the hushed reverence that had filled the room moments before. It felt wrong, a discordant note in the symphony of corporate power I was so desperately trying to conduct. "Mr. Thorne's gaze flickered back to me, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of our shared, ugly sentiment. He'd found a kindred spirit, it seemed, someone who understood the real world, the world where sentimentality was a liability and compassion a weakness. But as his eyes met mine, I saw something else flicker there, something that wasn't satisfaction, but a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker of something else. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the steely resolve that had made him a titan of industry. Yet that brief, unguarded moment had lodged itself in my mind, a tiny splinter of doubt. The janitor, still absorbed in his task, continued to work, his shoulders hunched, a silent testament to years of being invisible. He didn't look at us, didn't react. But I imagined I could feel the weight of his quiet dignity, a force far more potent than any boardroom decree. My own laughter felt like a physical stain, an indelible mark on my conscience, and I found myself instinctively wanting to scrub it away. The air in the office, once charged with the intoxicating scent of success, now felt heavy, suffocating, thick with unspoken judgments, and the palpable silence of a man deliberately diminished. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the plush carpet, to undo the sound that had escaped my lips. The polished surface of the desk, which had seemed so inviting, now reflected a distorted image of myself, a stranger with a cruel smile. The weight of that single, thoughtless laugh pressed down on me, a premonition of a far greater burden to come, a burden that would strip away the veneer of my ambition and expose the raw, unformed core of my humanity. The encounter, so brief, so seemingly insignificant, had cracked the foundation of my carefully constructed worldview, and I sensed, with a chilling certainty, that there was no going back. The echo of my laughter seemed to linger in the air long after Mr. Thorne had dismissed me with a curt nod. I walked out of his office, the heavy door clicking shut behind me like a final verdict. The polished hallway, once a symbol of aspiration, now felt like a gauntlet. Each step I took was heavy, my expensive shoes making an unfamiliar, intrusive sound on the pristine floor. The sterile, ozone-tinged air of the executive floor did little to clear the fog in my head. It was a physical discomfort, a tightness in my chest that made each breath shallow and ragged. I replayed the scene, the CEO's sneering words, my own pathetic response, the janitor's bowed head. It was a loop, a relentless playback of my own moral failing. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that it was just a joke, that Thorne was exaggerating, that the janitor probably hadn't even heard. But the image of that man's hunched shoulders, the almost imperceptible flinch, wouldn't recede. It was a wound, raw and exposed, and I felt an overwhelming urge to cauterize it, to pretend it hadn't happened. I pushed through the automatic doors, the sudden blast of cooler, more generic office air, a welcome, if temporary, reprieve. The cubicle farm stretched out before me, a sea of beige and grey, filled with the low hum of computers and the rustle of papers. It was my world, the world I was supposed to be fighting to escape, and now it felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could hide from the judgment I felt radiating from the executive suite. I sank into my chair, the worn fabric offering little comfort. My computer screen glowed, a blank canvas awaiting my analysis, but my mind was a chaotic storm. The figures and spreadsheets that usually occupied my thoughts were a distant murmur, drowned out by the insistent, intrusive memory of that man's silent dignity. Days bled into weeks, and the memory of that encounter refused to fade. It was a persistent hum beneath the surface of my daily life, a constant nagging reminder of my own capacity for cruelty. The polished veneer of ambition I had worn so carefully began to chip away, revealing a gnawing emptiness beneath. I found myself watching the cleaning staff now, their silent presence a constant, uncomfortable mirror. I saw the way people interacted with them, or rather didn't interact. The hurried steps, the averted gazes, the casual disregard. It was a pattern I had been oblivious to, a part of the corporate landscape I had accepted as natural. Now it felt like a deliberate, systemic cruelty, a quiet war waged against the invisible. I started lingering in the break room a little longer, not to eavesdrop on gossip or strategize for my next career move, but to observe. I saw a woman, her face etched with fatigue, meticulously wiping down the counters, her movements practiced and weary. I saw a man, his hands rough and calloused, emptying the overflowing trash bins, his silence a stark contrast to the boisterous conversations happening around him. These were not just employees, they were people, each with a story, a life, a history that existed entirely outside the sterile confines of the office. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I had judged them, had dismissed them, based on their uniform, their role, their perceived lack of ambition. My own ambition, once a driving force, now felt hollow, tainted by the ease with which I had dehumanized others. The desire to impress Mr. Thorne, to climb his ladder, had blinded me to the fundamental truth of shared humanity. The weight of that realization was immense, a crushing burden that made my previous anxieties about career advancement seem trivial, almost absurd. One evening, as the office lights dimmed and the usual exodus of employees thinned to a trickle, I saw him. The janitor from Mr. Thorne's office. He was in the main corridor, emptying the bins, his movements methodical. A small, almost imperceptible tremor ran through his hand as he lifted a heavy wastepaper basket, and a few crumpled papers spilled onto the floor. He sighed, a sound barely audible, and bent down to retrieve them. Without thinking, without analyzing, without any conscious decision, I walked over. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I knelt beside him, my knees protesting on the cool tile. I started picking up the fallen papers, my fingers brushing against his. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise, then suspicion. He was older than I'd initially thought, his face a roadmap of hard years, but his eyes held a quiet intelligence, a depth that I hadn't noticed before. I didn't speak. I just continued gathering the scattered documents, my movements deliberate, respectful. When I'd collected the last sheet, I carefully placed them back into the bin. Then I looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time I saw not a uniform, not a job title, but a person. I offered a small, hesitant nod, a gesture of acknowledgement, of apology. He held my gaze for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, a slow, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall of misunderstanding, a sliver of shared humanity. The silence between us was no longer charged with judgment, but with a fragile, tentative understanding. I stood up, my legs stiff, and without another word walked away, leaving him to his work. The air felt different now, lighter, cleaner. The weight on my chest had eased, replaced by a quiet, profound sense of peace. The following Monday, the office felt subtly altered. It was a change I could feel, a shift in the atmosphere that had little to do with the usual Monday morning rush. I saw the janitor again, this time in the breakroom refilling the coffee machine. He looked up as I entered, and this time there was no suspicion in his eyes, only a quiet acknowledgement. I offered him a small, genuine smile, and he returned it, a rare, fleeting expression that transformed his face. Later that day, as I was leaving, I saw him struggling with a heavy load of trash bags near the service elevator. This time, there was no hesitation. I walked over and opened the elevator door for him. He paused, looked at me, then at the elevator, and a hint of a smile touched his lips. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy but clear. It was the first time I had heard him speak. The words, simple and direct, resonated deeply. "You're welcome," I replied, my voice a little shaky. He nodded, a gesture of simple gratitude, and stepped into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, I realized that a profound shift had occurred within me. The relentless drive for personal success, the ambition that had once consumed me, had receded, replaced by a quiet understanding of connection, of shared experience. The laughter I had shared with the CEO now felt like a distant, unpleasant dream. The real awakening had come not from the pronouncements of power, but from the silent dignity of a man I had once so carelessly dismissed. The memory of that dismissive laugh still pricked at me, a sharp reminder of how easily I had been swayed by the allure of power, how readily I had adopted a cruel worldview to feel a sense of belonging. It was a humbling realization, a stripping away of ego that left me feeling vulnerable, but also, strangely, lighter. The world hadn't changed, but my perception of it had, irrevocably. The polished surfaces of the executive suite now seemed cold, sterile, a place where true connection withered. The quiet dignity I had witnessed in the janitor, in his simple act of retrieving scattered papers, in his weary but steady hands, held a far greater power, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. It wasn't about grand gestures or soaring rhetoric. It was in the small, often unseen acts of perseverance, of quiet resilience. My own ambition, once a blinding fire, now felt like a gentle ember, capable of providing warmth without scorching everything in its path. I understood with a clarity that surprised me that true success wasn't measured by the height of one's ascent, but by the depth of one's empathy, the breadth of one's compassion. The path ahead was no longer about conquering, but about connecting, about recognizing the shared humanity in every face, regardless of their uniform or their station. The world, once a battlefield of ambition, had become a tapestry of interconnected lives, each thread as vital as the next. The weight of that single, thoughtless laugh had been a precursor to a much larger burden, one of self-awareness and the quiet, arduous work of genuine change. It was a burden I now carried willingly, not as a punishment but as a compass. The sterile gleam of the executive suite no longer held its intoxicating promise. Its allure had faded, replaced by the quiet strength found in unexpected places. I had learned that the most profound insights often arrive not in the thunderous pronouncements of the powerful, but in the hushed dignity of those who serve, whose quiet presence shapes the world in ways we rarely acknowledge. The echo of shared humanity, a gentle whisper, now guides my way. The quiet nod from the janitor, a man whose name I still didn't know, felt more significant than any promotion I'd ever received. It wasn't a grand gesture of reconciliation, but a subtle acknowledgement, a bridge built across the chasm of my prior ignorance. This subtle shift in perception, this newfound awareness, began to ripple outward, affecting how I navigated the office environment. I started noticing the small courtesies that were routinely extended or withheld by my colleagues. The way some would hold doors open for senior staff but let them swing shut on those in support roles. The perfunctory thanks delivered without eye contact when a coffee was brought, contrasted with the effusive gratitude reserved for a peer who offered a helpful suggestion. These weren't earth-shattering events, but they were the granular details of an invisible social contract, one I had previously been blind to, or perhaps willfully ignored. Now each instance felt like a tiny, personal test. Would I fall back into old patterns, mirroring the casual disregard I had once participated in? Or would I consciously choose a different path, one that acknowledged the inherent worth of every individual, regardless of their perceived status? The temptation to revert to the familiar, to the path of least resistance, was strong. It was easier to blend in, to avoid the awkwardness of a gesture that might be misinterpreted or ignored. Yet the image of the janitor's face, the flicker of surprise giving way to a hint of a smile, was a constant, quiet imperative. Furthermore, this heightened sensitivity began to color my interactions beyond the office walls. Walking down the street, I found myself observing the city with new eyes. The hurried interactions at the coffee shop, the brief exchanges with the bus driver, the polite nod to the person walking their dog, each became a small opportunity to practice this nascent empathy. I started making a conscious effort to meet people's eyes, to offer a genuine smile, to use their names if I knew them, to simply acknowledge their presence with a warmth that went beyond mere politeness. It was a deliberate practice, like training a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. There were moments of awkwardness, of course. A smile met with a blank stare, a friendly greeting returned with suspicion. These instances were not discouraging, however. Instead, they served as valuable feedback, highlighting the ingrained barriers that societal conditioning and personal experience can erect between people. They underscored the depth of the challenge, the pervasive nature of the disconnect I was now actively trying to bridge. It was a slow, incremental process, marked by small victories and occasional setbacks, but the direction of travel was clear, and the internal reward, a growing sense of connection, was a powerful motivator. Building on this, however, I also began to reevaluate my own motivations and aspirations. The relentless pursuit of career advancement, which had once seemed like the ultimate goal, now felt somewhat hollow. The desire to impress figures like Mr. Thorne, to ascend a hierarchical ladder that was built on a foundation of perceived superiority, lost its urgency. Instead, a different kind of aspiration began to take root. The desire to contribute, to connect, to be a force for positive interaction. However small, this wasn't a rejection of ambition entirely, but a redefinition of it. It became less about personal gain and more about fostering a sense of shared humanity, about contributing to a more compassionate and understanding environment, both in my professional and personal life. This subtle but significant reframing of my goals brought a sense of purpose that transcended the transactional nature of corporate life. It was a deeper, more resonant form of fulfillment, one that was rooted in connection rather than competition. Consequently, the way I approached problem-solving, both at work and in my personal life, began to shift. Where before I might have focused solely on the most efficient or profitable solution, I now found myself considering the human element more deeply. How would a particular decision impact the individuals involved, particularly those in less visible roles? What were the potential unseen consequences, the ripple effects that might extend beyond the immediate objective? This expanded perspective didn't necessarily lead to slower decision-making, but it did lead to more considered and often more equitable outcomes. It was about recognizing that every system, every organization is ultimately composed of individuals, and that their well-being and their sense of being valued are not peripheral concerns, but integral components of any sustainable success. This shift was not about abandoning logic or efficiency, but about integrating a more profound understanding of human needs and interactions into the very fabric of decision-making. Another crucial layer to this emerging perspective was the understanding that this transformation was not a destination, but an ongoing journey. There were still moments, I realized, when the old cynicism would surface, when the ingrained habit of judgment would try to reassert itself. These were not moments of failure, but rather opportunities for continued practice and self-reflection. The key was not to achieve a state of perfect empathy, but to remain vigilant, to acknowledge the slip-ups, and to consciously recommit to the path of understanding. It was about the continuous conscious effort to see the world and the people within it, with greater clarity and compassion, recognizing that growth is a perpetual process, not a finished product. This ongoing commitment to self-awareness and mindful interaction became the bedrock of my evolving approach to life. The realization that genuine connections superseded superficial ambition began to reshape my daily interactions in subtle yet profound ways. I found myself actively seeking opportunities to bridge the perceived gaps between different roles within the company. Instead of solely focusing on my immediate team's deliverables, I started looking for interdepartmental synergies that could benefit everyone, not just those at the top. For instance, I noticed that the facilities management team, responsible for maintaining the physical infrastructure, often worked with outdated inventory systems that led to delays and inefficiencies. My analytical skills, previously honed for financial forecasting, could be repurposed to help them streamline their tracking and ordering processes. Presenting this idea wasn't about seeking personal glory, but about offering a practical solution that would alleviate their daily burdens. The conversation with the head of facilities was markedly different from my usual presentations to senior management. It was less about profit margins and more about practical improvements, about making their jobs easier and more efficient. The gratitude expressed wasn't the performative acknowledgement often seen in executive circles, but a genuine appreciation for being seen and heard, for having their operational challenges recognized and addressed. This shift in focus also extended to how I approached conflict resolution. In the past, I might have viewed disagreements as opportunities to assert dominance or prove my superior logic. Now I approach them as invitations to deeper understanding. When a colleague expressed frustration over a perceived slight or a misunderstanding, my immediate instinct wasn't to defend myself or assign blame, but to actively listen, to seek out the underlying emotions and unmet needs driving their reaction. This involved asking clarifying questions, not to trap them in their words, but to truly grasp their perspective. For example, a heated exchange arose between my team and the marketing department regarding the messaging on a new product launch. Previously, I would have dug in my heels, defending our data-driven projections. Now, I made an effort to understand the marketing team's concerns about market perception and customer resonance, even if their reasoning seemed less quantifiable than mine. The outcome was a collaborative revision of the launch strategy, one that integrated both data-driven insights and market-sensitive messaging, resulting in a more robust and ultimately more successful campaign. The process itself fostered a stronger sense of camaraderie and mutual respect, proving that genuine collaboration often yields superior results to adversarial debate. Furthermore, this evolving perspective prompted a re-evaluation of my own communication style. I began to pay closer attention to the power dynamics inherent in language. The subtle nuances of tone, the implicit assumptions embedded in certain phrases, and the impact of non-verbal cues became critical elements of my awareness. I consciously worked to soften my directness, to temper analytical pronouncements with empathetic framing, and to ensure my feedback, even when critical, was delivered with respect for the recipient's dignity. This meant, for instance, transitioning from statements like, "Your report lacks sufficient data," to a more collaborative approach, such as, "This is a great starting point for the report." To strengthen it further, perhaps we could explore incorporating XYZ data points, which might offer deeper insights into customer behavior. This adjustment wasn't about diluting my professional rigor, but about ensuring that my communication fostered understanding and growth rather than defensiveness or resentment. It was about recognizing that the how of communication is often as impactful as the what. The ripple effect of this personal transformation also began to manifest in my engagement with broader company initiatives. I found myself drawn to committees and projects that focused on employee well-being, diversity and inclusion, or community outreach, areas that had previously seemed secondary to the core business objectives. My analytical skills, once solely applied to financial metrics, were now being utilized to assess the effectiveness of employee resource groups, to identify barriers to inclusion, or to measure the impact of corporate social responsibility programs. This wasn't a departure from my professional role, but an expansion of it, an understanding that a truly successful organization is one that thrives not just economically, but also ethically and socially. It was about recognizing that investing in the human capital and the broader community was not a cost, but a fundamental investment in the long-term health and resilience of the entire enterprise. This broadened scope brought a new dimension of meaning to my work, transforming it from a pursuit of personal advancement into a contribution to a larger, more meaningful endeavor. The subtle recalibration of my internal compass began to extend beyond the immediate professional sphere, influencing how I perceived everyday interactions and the broader social fabric. I noticed, for instance, the unconscious biases that often permeated casual conversations, the way assumptions were made based on superficial characteristics. A fleeting thought about someone's background, a quick judgment formed on appearance alone, now felt like a jarring dissonance, a reminder of the superficiality I was striving to transcend. This led to a conscious effort to unpack these ingrained assumptions, to question the origins of my immediate perceptions. Now consider the subtle but pervasive influence of media portrayals. How often are certain professions or demographics consistently depicted in simplistic, often stereotypical ways? This constant, almost subliminal reinforcement can shape our unconscious biases, leading us to categorize individuals before we truly encounter them. My own awakening involved actively seeking out narratives and perspectives that challenged these ingrained stereotypes, engaging with stories and people that offered a more nuanced, multifaceted view of human experience. It was about dismantling the mental shorthand that had previously guided my judgments, replacing it with a more deliberate and empathetic form of observation. The journey toward a more ethically grounded existence is a testament to the profound impact of unexpected encounters, a reminder that growth often lies just beyond the edges of our comfort zones. It underscores that the most significant transformations are rarely born from grand gestures, but from the quiet accumulation of conscious choices, each one a step towards a more integrated and compassionate self. The world we inhabit is not a static entity, but a dynamic reflection of our collective engagement, and the power to shape it, to infuse it with greater understanding and kindness, resides within each of us, in every interaction, every single day. The quiet nod, a simple gesture of shared humanity, holds more power than any executive decree.